September 13th, 1985. 70 kilometers outside of Moscow, surrounded by birch forests that were already beginning to turn yellow with the approaching Russian autumn, stood the Serpukhov F-15 Command Center. From the outside, it looked like just another gray, brutalist concrete structure typical of the Soviet military apparatus. Inside, it was the nervous center of the Voiska PVO, the Air Defense Forces. In a dimly lit room, hummed by the sound of cooling fans and colossal Ryad mainframe computers, a young lieutenant sat before a flickering green phosphor screen. His job was monotony itself, tracking the thousands of pieces of metal orbiting the Earth. He knew them all by heart. Defunct boosters, active spy satellites, debris from tests a decade old. They were predictable. They followed the immutable laws of physics. Until today. At 22:43 Moscow time, an anomaly appeared on his scope. He was tracking object 11,788. To the Americans, it was Solwind P-78-1, an aging scientific satellite launched 6 years earlier to study the sun. It was a harmless piece of equipment, 326 miles up, weighing nearly a ton. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. And then, in the span of a single radar sweep, it wasn't. The solid blip on his screen didn't just fade, it shattered. Where there had been one object, there was now a rapidly expanding cloud of hundreds of smaller returns. A debris field. The lieutenant tapped his glass screen, a useless human reflex when faced with electronic impossibility. Satellites don't just explode. They might die, they might tumble, but they don't disintegrate into shrapnel without cause. He immediately checked his threat board. There had been no launch warnings, no massive thermal plumes detected by their own orbital watchers, no seismic activity indicating an American ICBM silo opening. The sky was cold, the sky was quiet, but something had just reached up from the Earth and violently erased a 1-ton satellite. He picked up the secure red phone. He didn't know it yet, but that call was the beginning of a crisis that would shake the highest levels of the Kremlin. To understand why the loss of a single aging scientific satellite caused such panic, we have to understand the mindset of the Soviet Union in 1985. They were a superpower on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Only 2 years prior, in 1983, they had come terrifyingly close to nuclear war during NATO's Able Archer exercises. They were led by old, sick men, first Andropov, then Chernenko, and now a newly appointed Mikhail Gorbachev, who was desperately trying to save a crumbling economy. They knew, deep down, they were falling behind, but their greatest fear had a name, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan's Star Wars. Since 1983, Reagan had been publicly promising a shield that would make nuclear weapons obsolete, a network of space-based lasers and kinetic weapons that could shoot down Soviet missiles before they even left the atmosphere. Soviet scientists, brilliant as they were, told the Politburo that such a system was decades away, perhaps physically impossible. But the generals didn't trust their scientists. They trusted what they could see. And what they just saw on that radar screen near Moscow was proof that the Americans weren't just talking anymore. They had done it. They had tested a space weapon, and it worked perfectly. The report from Serpukhov 15 didn't stop at a low-level commander's desk. Within hours, it was in the hands of the General Staff of the Armed Forces in Moscow. General Vitaly Shabanov, Deputy Minister of Defense for Armaments, stared at the initial assessment. The implications were horrifying. It wasn't about Solwind P-78-1. That old satellite was just a target dummy. The real targets were much more valuable and much more vulnerable. The Soviet Union relied on a specific constellation of satellites called OKO, or the Eye. These were their early warning sentinels. Sitting in highly elliptical Molniya orbits, they watched the continental United States 24 hours a day. Their infrared sensors were designed to detect the massive heat bloom of a Minuteman III missile launch. If the Americans now had a weapon that could silently, instantly wipe satellites out of the sky, the eye could be blinded. In Cold War strategic thinking, this was known as a decapitation strike. If you can blind the enemy's early warning system, you can launch a nuclear-first strike before they even know they are under attack. You take away their ability to retaliate. You win the unwinnable war. By the morning of September 14th, the paranoia in Moscow had crystallized into a desperate, frantic hunt. A secret committee was formed, drawing experts from the GRU, the Strategic Rocket Forces, and their top aerospace bureaus. Their mission was simple, yet impossible. Find the invisible killer. They began by looking for the usual suspects. The Soviet Union's own anti-satellite program, the Istrebitel Sputnikov, or satellite fighter, was a massive, clumsy brute. It required a huge rocket, hours of preparation, and multiple orbits to slowly creep up on its target before detonating like a space grenade. It was effective, but about as subtle as a sledgehammer. Surely, they reasoned, the Americans must have used something similar. They ordered every available intelligence asset to scour the United States. They looked at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. They looked at Cape Canaveral in Florida. They even looked at the secluded testing ranges in White Sands, New Mexico. They were looking for massive scorch marks on launch pads, the movement of heavy rail cars carrying rocket stages, the chatter of thousands of technicians preparing a launch. The reports came back, one after another. Negative. Nothing. Quiet. Vandenberg had been sleepy. The Cape was preparing for a routine shuttle mission, nothing more. There was absolutely no evidence that a rocket large enough to reach 300 miles into space had been fired from American soil. This absence of evidence was more terrifying than finding a smoking gun. If it wasn't a rocket, what was it? The whispers began in the corridors of the Kremlin. Darker theories. Had the Americans perfected a ground-based laser powerful enough to burn through the atmosphere? It seemed scientifically implausible. The power requirements would be staggering, like draining a city's entire electrical grid for a split second. But then, Solwind was gone. Or worse, was the weapon already up there? Had one of the recent space shuttle missions secretly deployed sleeper mines? Tiny, undetectable killer satellites that had been drifting silently for months, just waiting for a coded signal to wake up and strike. If that was true, then every single Soviet satellite in orbit, their spy cameras, their communications relays, their nuclear early warning eyes, might already have a silent assassin floating right next to it, ready to detonate on command. Moscow wasn't just afraid anymore. They felt naked. They were fighting a ghost, and they had no idea that the ghost wasn't a billion-dollar superweapon. It was something far more dangerous. It was a simple idea, executed with breathtaking precision. While the Kremlin was jumping at shadows in the dark, chasing phantoms of giant lasers and space mines, the actual culprit was hiding in plain sight. It was sitting on a sun-baked runway 6,000 miles away at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It wasn't a secret billion-dollar science fiction project buried under a mountain. It was an aircraft that Soviet intelligence officers saw every single day. They saw it patrolling the borders of West Germany. They saw it flying training sorties over Japan. It was the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. To the Soviet mindset, using a fighter jet to kill a satellite was absurd. Their own aerospace philosophy was built on rigid specialization. You build a massive rocket to go to space. You build a fast interceptor, like the MiG-25, to chase bombers. You don't mix them. It was structurally inefficient, aerodynamically dangerous, and strategically pointless. But they misunderstood their enemy. The Americans didn't want a massive rocket. They didn't want a weapon that required days of preparation and a fixed launch pad that could be easily monitored by spy satellites. In a real shooting war, World War III, those fixed launch pads in Florida and California would be the first things vaporized by Soviet nukes. The Pentagon needed a weapon that could survive the first day of Armageddon. They needed something flexible, something that could move. The motive for this weapon wasn't just abstract Cold War posturing. It was born from a very specific, very deadly naval threat. By the early 1980s, the U.S. Navy had realized it was sailing into a trap. Their massive aircraft carrier battle groups, the supreme symbols of American power projection, were being stalked. The Soviet Union had deployed a lethal combination of satellites, RORSATS, radar ocean reconnaissance satellites, that used powerful radar to punch through clouds, and EORSATS, electronic intelligence satellites, that listened for the radio chatter of an American fleet. These satellites were the spotters. Once they found a U.S. carrier in the middle of the Atlantic, they would relay the coordinates to squadrons of Tupolev II 22M backfire bombers, loaded with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles. In a full-scale war, the U.S. Navy calculated they would lose multiple carriers within the first 48 hours because of these eyes in the sky. They had to be blinded, and they had to be blinded fast before the backfire bombers could launch. Enter the Celestial Eagle. This was the classified code name for the highly modified F-15A chosen for the mission. The Air Force realized that the F-15 wasn't just a dogfighter. With its twin Pratt and Whitney F-100 engines, it actually had a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1. It could accelerate while flying straight up. It was, effectively, a reusable first-stage booster rocket that happened to have wings and a cockpit. But a great launch pad needs a perfect bullet. And this is where American engineers achieved the technological miracle that truly baffled the Soviets. The weapon they built, the ASM-135, was a Frankenstein monster of spare parts and cutting-edge genius. The first stage was taken from an old nuclear attack missile. The second stage was a standard rocket motor used for orbital adjustments. But the tip of the spear, the actual killer, was something entirely new. The Soviets, with their Istrebitel Sputnikov, used a shotgun approach. Their killer satellite would get close to the target and detonate a massive shrapnel warhead, hoping one of the thousands of metal fragments would score a hit. It was crude, dirty, and littered low Earth orbit with dangerous junk. The Americans decided to use a sniper rifle. They developed the Miniature Homing Vehicle, or MHV. It was incredibly small, just 12 inches long and weighing barely 30 pounds. It looked less like a weapon and more like an oversized tomato can wrapped in sensors. Inside this small metal cylinder was a technological marvel far ahead of anything Moscow possessed. It had a cryogenically cooled infrared seeker that could spot the faint heat signature of a satellite against the absolute zero background of deep space. It had a laser ring gyroscope for perfect stability, and it had dozens of tiny explosive thrusters around its rim. It wouldn't just fly toward the target, it would adjust. It would twitch and correct its path milliseconds before impact. The concept was called hit to kill. There were no explosives aboard the MHV. None were needed. The plan was to slam this 30-pound cylinder directly into a 1-ton satellite at a combined closing speed of 15,000 miles per hour. At that speed, physics changes. Solid objects behave like liquids. The kinetic energy released upon impact would be roughly equivalent to a large bomb, instantly vaporizing both the target and the killer into a cloud of superheated plasma. It was a magic bullet. But testing it required a marksman who could do the impossible. Flying this mission wouldn't be like standard combat. It required a pilot to take an air-breathing jet fighter to altitudes where the air was so thin, conventional controls stopped working. It required a maneuver that was terrifyingly counterintuitive, a suicidal climb straight into the black void, knowing that if you pushed the aircraft just 1% too far, its engines would flame out, and it would enter an unrecoverable flat spin, tumbling all the way back to Earth. The Americans had the weapon. They had the plane. Now, they just needed the perfect test subject to prove it worked. They needed a target that wouldn't be missed, and a day that would send a message. They chose September 13th, 1985, and they chose Solwind P-78-1. The stage was set for the perfect crime. Every flawlessly planned assassination needs a calm, meticulous executioner. For this mission, the U.S. Air Force didn't choose a daredevil. They chose an engineer who could fly like a surgeon, Major Wilbert Doug Pearson. Pearson wasn't just flying the plane. He had helped write the manual for this specific insane maneuver. He knew exactly how thin the margin for error was. On the morning of September 13th, Edwards Air Force Base was deceptively routine. The Celestial Eagle, tail number 76-0084, sat on the tarmac. To an untrained observer, it looked like any other F-15 preparing for a test flight, except for the massive 18-foot black missile slung underneath its belly. There was no grand countdown, no breathless worldwide television coverage like a space shuttle launch. It was just Pearson, his wingman in a chase plane, and a voice controller back at base. The perfect cover for a historic kill. Pearson took off and headed west over the Pacific Ocean, climbing to a standard cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. He was waiting for a very specific moment in time. The target, Solwind P-78-1, was currently racing across the North Pole at 17,000 miles an hour, heading south toward the California coast. The math required for the intercept was staggering. Pearson had to arrive at a precise invisible box in the sky at the exact split second the satellite was passing hundreds of miles overhead. If he was 10 seconds late, he missed. If he was 10 seconds early, he missed. As the countdown clock in his cockpit ticked down, Pearson pushed the throttles forward. Full military power. Then, afterburner. Twin tongues of 30-foot flame erupted from the rear of the F-15. The aircraft surged from a gentle cruise to Mach 1.22, faster than the speed of sound. The G-forces began to build, pressing Pearson into his ejection seat. Then, the impossible maneuver began. Normal fighter jets climb at steep angles, but they don't do what Pearson did next. He pulled back on the stick, hard. The nose of the F-15 rose up and kept rising. 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees. He settled the aircraft at exactly 65 degrees nose up. He was no longer flying a plane, he was riding a rocket. At this angle, the wings of the F-15 were practically useless. They weren't generating lift anymore. The only thing keeping 20 tons of metal in the air was the raw, brute thrust of those two Pratt and Whitney engines screaming at their absolute limit. Inside the cockpit, the world tilted and disappeared. The blue horizon of the Pacific dropped away, replaced by the rapidly darkening violet of the upper stratosphere. He was leaving the breathable atmosphere behind. At 35,000 feet, 36,000 feet, 37,000 feet. The air outside was becoming dangerously thin. The engines began to gasp for oxygen. If they flamed out now, the F-15 would become a brick falling from the edge of space. The cockpit warnings were screaming silently on his heads-up display, telling him he was approaching the absolute aerodynamic limit of the airframe. He held it steady. His eyes were locked on the targeting reticle. He didn't have to pull the trigger. The computer was flying the final seconds. At exactly 38,100 feet, a shudder ran through the entire aircraft. Ker-chunk! The ASM-135 dropped free from the centerline pylon. For a fraction of a second, it just fell alongside the F-15, two machines suspended together near the top of the world. Then, the missile's solid rocket motor ignited. A blinding streak of white fire seared past Pearson's canopy. The missile accelerated away with such violence that it was gone from sight in seconds, racing upwards into the pure black void. Pearson didn't have time to watch it go. He was now flying a plane that was dangerously slow, incredibly high, and about to stall. He had to execute a violent recovery maneuver, rolling the F-15 inverted and pulling the nose down toward the ocean, diving back into the thicker air where his wings could work again. While Pearson fought to recover his jet, the missile continued its silent, deadly journey. It shed its first stage, then its second. High above the atmosphere, the miniature homing vehicle, MHV, spun free. Its infrared eye snapped open, instantly scanning the cold darkness. It found it. A faint, warm dot against the freezing backdrop of deep space. Solwind P-78-1. The tiny thrusters on the MHV began to fire, pop, 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 making microscopic corrections, refining the intercept course. It was a robot kamikaze, completely autonomous, closing the distance at 4 miles per second. Back in the Soviet Union, the radar lieutenant was just watching the steady blip of Object 11,788. In space, there is no sound. The impact was totally silent. The MHV slammed into the Solwind satellite with tremendous kinetic fury. The energy release was spectacular. In an instant, a 1-ton scientific instrument, full of solar panels, instruments, and metal framing, was atomized. It didn't just break apart. It was vaporized into a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated plasma and thousands of pieces of shrapnel. The kill was absolute. Major Doug Pearson, now leveled off at a safe altitude and heading back to Edwards, got a simple coded message over his radio. The mission was a success. He had just become the first and only pilot in history to shoot down a spacecraft. He landed quietly. There was no fanfare. The technicians simply rearmed the jet and pushed it back into its hangar. It looked just like it had 2 hours ago. The perfect crime had been committed. The shooter had escaped, and the weapon had vanished. Now, the Americans just had to wait for Moscow to figure out what had just happened to them. For days after September 13th, the Soviet defense apparatus remained trapped in its own feedback loop of paranoia. The committees in Moscow continued to debate theories about ground-based lasers and secret space mines. They were looking for a technologically complex, exorbitantly expensive explanation because that's what they would have done. They couldn't conceive that the answer was simple, cheap, and already deployed. The truth didn't arrive via a classified spy report from a deep-cover KGB agent in the Pentagon. It arrived via the Associated Press. When the U.S. Department of Defense finally released a terse, 3-paragraph statement confirming the successful test of the ASM-135 anti-satellite missile launched from an F-15, the reaction inside the Kremlin was a mixture of disbelief and horror. General Shabanov read the report. Then he read it again. The sheer audacity of it was stunning. The Americans hadn't built a new Death Star. They had taken a standard fighter jet, a plane that NATO had hundreds of, stationed from West Germany to Japan to Alaska, and turned every single one of them into a potential strategic space weapon. The implications redefined the entire concept of orbital security. Until that moment, space was considered a sanctuary, protected by sheer distance and the immense difficulty of getting there. If you wanted to shoot something down, you needed a massive rocket, a fixed launch pad, and days of visible preparation. Soviet spy satellites could see that coming a mile away. They would have warning. But an F-15? An F-15 could take off from anywhere. It could be refueled in mid-air. It could fly thousands of miles, virtually undetected amidst routine air traffic, suddenly pop up to 38,000 feet, launch a killer missile, and disappear back onto a standard patrol route before anyone knew what happened. Moscow realized with dawning horror that they could no longer trust any American fighter jet they saw on radar. Was it just on a training flight? Or was it about to blind their entire early warning network? The invisible box in the sky, the launch point, could now be moved anywhere around the globe. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Arctic Circle. The Americans didn't just have a new weapon, they had achieved total unpredictability. Panic is a powerful motivator, but rarely a good engineer. The Soviet response was immediate, desperate, and ultimately doomed. The order came straight from the top. Copy it. Now. They couldn't use just any fighter. Their standard Su-27s or MiG-29s didn't have the raw power or the ceiling of the F-15 for such a specific mission. They had only one aircraft that could even theoretically attempt the impossible climb: the Mikoyan MiG-31, NATO codename Foxhound. The MiG-31 was a beast of an aircraft. It was massive, fast, and designed to hunt American bombers in the high Arctic. It was a specialized interceptor, not a flexible dogfighter like the F-15, but it was all they had. A crash program, codenamed Contact, was launched. Two special MiG-31s, designated MiG-31D, were pulled off the assembly line and heavily modified. They were stripped of their radars, their cannons, and standard missile pylons to save weight. They added enormous new winglets to try and stabilize the aircraft at high altitudes, but the real problem was the missile. Soviet technology in the mid-80s simply wasn't capable of miniaturizing a complex infrared seeker and guidance system into a 30-pound smart rock like the American MHV. They didn't have the microprocessors, they didn't have the advanced optics, so they did what they always did. They built it bigger. Their answer to the 3,000-pound American ASM-135 was the 79 M6 contact missile. It was a colossal 10,000-pound monster. It was so huge it barely fit under the belly of the massive MiG-31. Carrying this Leviathan completely ruined the flight characteristics of the aircraft. It was dangerous to fly, sluggish, and terrifyingly unstable during the high-speed climb needed for launch. Worse, because they couldn't master hit-to-kill technology, the 79 M6 still had to use a massive conventional warhead, relying on a shotgun blast of shrapnel rather than a precision sniper shot. It was exactly the kind of crude, brute force solution the Americans had already made obsolete. While American pilots were already training with operational ASM-135s, Soviet engineers were still struggling just to get their copycat airborne without crashing. The first prototype, MiG-31D, didn't even fly until 1987, 2 full years after Major Pearson's historic kill. By then, it was already too late. The Soviet economy was in freefall. Gorbachev's perestroika reforms were failing. The billions of rubles needed to perfect the contact system simply evaporated. The MiG-31Ds were eventually parked on a remote runway in Kazakhstan, collecting dust, sad, hulking monuments to a race they had lost before they even knew it had started. The Americans had won not by outspending them, but by outthinking them. They had leveraged flexibility against brute force, precision against mass. And as the Cold War entered its final thawing years, A new, terrifying realization began to settle in the minds of the Soviet General Staff. The F-15 ASAT test hadn't just been a technological demonstration. It had been an act of supreme economic warfare. In the end, the most devastating statistic of the F-15 ASAT program wasn't its speed, its altitude, or its kill ratio. It was its cost. The entire American program, from the initial blueprints on a napkin to Major Pearson's historic shot, cost the U.S. taxpayers approximately $250 million. In the grand scheme of Cold War defense spending, where a single B-2 bomber would later cost nearly $1 billion, this was pocket change. It was a rounding error in the Pentagon's budget. Yet, this relatively tiny investment forced the Soviet Union into a panicked, multi-billion ruble tailspin. It's estimated that between hardening their existing satellites, attempting to accelerate their own laser programs, and the disastrous Contact MiG-31 project, Moscow burned through the equivalent of over $2 billion in today's money. They spent nearly 10 times what the Americans did, just trying to catch up to a threat they hadn't seen coming. This was the true genius of the American strategy in the 1980s. It wasn't just about having better weapons. It was about imposing crushing costs on an adversary that was already economically terminally ill. The F-15 ASAT was perhaps the most efficient example of this cost-imposing strategy ever devised. Every dollar the Soviets spent trying to build a giant anti-satellite missile was a dollar they couldn't spend on hospitals, on food, or on modernizing their crumbling civilian infrastructure. In a very real way, the F-15 didn't just shoot down a satellite, it helped shoot down the Soviet economy itself. Ironically, the F-15 ASAT program never officially became fully operational. By 1988, the political winds had shifted. The Cold War was thawing. Arms control treaties were gaining momentum. The U.S. Congress, fearing that deploying such a destabilizing weapon would spark a dangerous new arms race in space that nobody could afford, cut funding for the program. The Air Force canceled it. The remaining ASM-135 missiles were put into storage, then eventually sent to museums. The Celestial Eagle F-15S were quietly converted back into standard fighter jets and returned to regular squadrons. But it didn't matter. The point had already been proven. The message had been sent, loud and clear. We can reach you anywhere, anytime, for pennies on the dollar. The mere existence of the technology was enough to serve as a strategic deterrent for the remainder of the Cold War. Today, the legacy of that September day in 1985 is more relevant than ever. We live in a world, once again, defined by great power competition. Russia and China have both tested their own modern anti-satellite missiles, ground-based leviathans that create massive clouds of dangerous space debris, threatening the International Space Station and civilian constellations like Starlink. The U.S. Space Force, the newest branch of the American military, is now grappling with the same problems their predecessors faced 40 years ago. How do you protect your eyes in the sky? Some strategists are looking back at history and asking a provocative question. Is it time to bring back the air-launched ASAT? Modern technology has only made the concept more viable. Today's missiles are smaller, smarter, and more lethal. Today's aircraft, like the F-22 Raptor or F-35 Lightning II, can fly higher and stealthier than the old F-15 ever could. Imagine a fleet of F-35s dispersed across the Pacific on tiny island airfields, each carrying a next-generation, miniaturized anti-satellite weapon in its internal weapons bay. They would be completely invisible to enemy radar until the moment they launched. It would be the ultimate ghost killer all over again, but this time with 21st century stealth technology. Would such a weapon stabilize a future conflict by deterring an enemy from attacking U.S. satellites? Or would it just accelerate a new, even more dangerous arms race that turns low Earth orbit into a permanent shooting gallery? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And as we look up at a sky increasingly crowded with the satellites that power our modern world, the echo of Major Doug Pearson's impossible climb in 1985 rings louder than ever. It was the day warfare officially left the planet, and we are still living in the shadow of that silent, invisible shot.